Bill, the situation down there now going to be even worse than expected. Has the sense of urgency there increased tonight?
Absolutely, Anderson. You can feel it. It's been interesting. We've been down here for the last 36 hours or so, and in the beginning they were raising rum drinks and making fun of those who evacuated prematurely, they said. But just in the last several hours, as these reports came in, the traffic on US 1 heading north is noticeably heavier. A man on his bicycle just rode by and said, I was going to ride it out. No, I got to go north. I got to go as far north as I can. We are on Cudjoe Key, right above the lower keys. Below us, a stunning, sort of prototypical Key West sunset happening back there, but there is nobody in Mallory Square, trust me, watching that with a boat drink tonight. In fact, many of them have brought their cars here, and this shows the desperation when you live inches above sea level. This is one of the mountaintops of the Florida Keys where we are, right up against a bridge, and people have parked their cars, they've jammed them in. If you can see that Jeep Wrangler there, that guy took the winch on the front of his Jeep and lashed it around one of these guardrails as one more piece of protection against what is now we know will be Category 5 winds.
It seems like it's calmed down a little bit since we saw you a few minutes ago. It's coming in waves, right?
That's absolutely right, Wolf. It's not blowing that hard. There's no rain. But, just about 15, 20 minutes ago when we last spoke, it was a very different picture. Yep. Let me just get my jacket on. Woo! And Wolf, I didn't have a rain jacket on when this squall hit because it had not rained a single drop here all day long. We hadn't seen any rain, and it just goes to show how quickly these things can come out of nowhere. So if you are in Florida awaiting this storm, don't be outside. Don't be near the water. Don't be in a place where something like this can surprise you. We're on the weak side of the storm. The storm is not expected to make direct landfall here. It is passing off the coast. Cuba is actually missing a bullet here. It's going to strike Florida as a much more dangerous storm. But that intensity, that brief moment there, we were just, it felt like a jet engine. I could not get the jacket on. I was having trouble standing. It just goes to show how quickly conditions change, how dangerous a hurricane can be. And it's only beginning here, I suspect, throughout the evening and into tomorrow morning. We will get more moments like this where it just comes at you in a wave, and there's very little you can do to defend yourself against it. The power of Mother Nature is really an incredible but also very scary thing.
in the eye of the storm. Here's what has happened over the past hour. We've been
Irma is now the strongest hurricane to ever plow into the Leeward Islands. Yesterday we mentioned only Hurricane Allen from 1980 was stronger in recorded history for the Atlantic by 5 miles per hour. Irma today, however, has surpassed Allen by continuing to churn for over 24 hours with winds above 180. Allen never did that. We are going to get in closer now and take a look at this massive eye that was 23 miles in diameter. Yesterday expected it to swallow up Barbuda, St. Martin, Anguilla. Communication is out. Power is out. Until the back edge slides through these islands, aircraft will not be able to get up to assess the damage from above. I'm sure civil emergency management crews are on the ground trying to assess the damage, but we have had no contact. The system is moving at 16 miles per hour. Remember, Harvey only moved at 2 or 3. We could outwalk it. But on Barbuda, if you look at the winds, gusts 118, 27, 131, 151, 154, 155, and then the instrument broke. That's how massive the storm is. 4 to 6 foot storm surge on the northern coast of Puerto Rico. The center is now 55 miles from San Juan. hurricane-force winds are spreading across the island. So again, heavy amounts of rain, mainly in the mountainous areas, could cause obviously some landslides, flash flooding, and a concern on the coastline. Warnings now in the Turk and Caicos. They're expecting a storm surge of 20 to 25 feet because they're going to be in the north and northeastern quadrant. That's where the winds are going to be a little stronger in those surf waves as they crash into that area. Here is the change. Now, from last night until this morning, the National Hurricane Center shifted the center. Notice where we have our little Category 4 in southern Florida. Shifted about 60 to 70 miles eastward. They have left the cone of uncertainty stretching west. That gives us that window if the system decides to edge that direction. But they also have extended that cone of uncertainty further eastward, which may now tell us if it's continuing to trend eastward, maybe we're looking at a landfall either on Miami, along the east coast of Florida, or into the Carolinas. Let's break it down a little closer for you and look at these spaghetti plots. Another change is this. Yesterday, more of the models moved in to Cuba. The higher terrain with the mountains over 6,000 meters would shred the system down and maybe break it down to a Category 2. Most of the models do not interact with Cuba now, so it sustains its strength over the very warm waters. Still, sometime Saturday, a turn to the north. And now, with that shift eastward, it looks like Monroe County, Miami-Dade, right on to Miami, maybe even making its way along the coast, possibly back over water around Cape Canaveral, slides into Savannah, Georgia. If I show you quickly what the models are doing, again, let's just go ahead and pull up the U.S. and the European. They're on top of each other right now. Let's put this into motion. You're going to see no interaction with Cuba. Here is landfall near Miami. It continues to make its way northward. Both models carry it back over water and then into Georgia and the Carolinas. We've got an interesting situation right now we're setting up because we now have Jose back behind the system as a hurricane and another one. But just to remind you of what Matthew did along the coastline, $15 billion in economic losses, and that was just off the coast. Guess what? Katia just became a hurricane. In the southern Gulf of Mexico, we have 3. It has not happened since 2010 when we had Carl, Julia, and Igor, I believe it was. But Jose may become a major category, follow suit, and come very close to those northern islands again of the Lesser Antilles before turning northward. This is getting crazy, Wolf.
We're back with our politics lead now. President Trump is pitching his tax reform plan in North Dakota, just one of a slew of competing priorities the White House is hoping to pass through Congress. Earlier today, the president, quote, blindsided Republican congressional leaders, according to a Republican official, by quickly agreeing with Democrats on a plan to tie funding for Harvey recovery to a 3-month extension on the country's debt limit and a stopgap spending bill. The Democratic proposal, House Speaker Paul Ryan had just hours before called ridiculous, which leads us to another episode of, is there a tweet for that? Is there something in the vast reservoir of Trump tweet archives that has him criticizing the exact same thing he did today? You already know the answer. Here's Donald Trump in 2013. Quote, the worst negotiators in history, otherwise known as Republicans, have just offered to suspend debt ceiling for 4 months. Pathetic. CNN White House correspondent Sarah Murray has more on a move that blindsided the president's own party in Congress.
We have a lot to discuss, including the fact that there's a new and seems to be record-breaking hurricane heading right toward Florida and Puerto Rico.
With another hurricane bearing down on the U.S., President Trump is reaching across the aisle to prove he can strike a deal on disaster relief for Hurricane Harvey and avoid a fiscal crisis.
We essentially came to a deal, and I think the deal will be very good. We had a very, very cordial and professional meeting.
Trump siding with Democrats today.
We had a very good meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer.
And ignoring the protests of GOP leaders and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin as he threw his support behind bundling Harvey disaster relief with a 3-month proposal to raise the debt limit and a 3-month stopgap spending bill.
Everyone is in favor, obviously, of taking care of that situation, so we all very much agree.
Trump confirmed the deal just hours after House Speaker Paul Ryan panned the Democrats' proposal on the Hill.
I think that's ridiculous and disgraceful that they want to play politics with the debt ceiling at this moment.
Trump's move comes on the heels of a meeting with top congressional leaders at the White House on a day when Democrats had been fiercely critical of the president in the wake of his decision to end the so-called DACA program.
The president's decision to end DACA was heartless and it was brainless.
Hours after the Trump administration announced it was ending a program that protected young people from deportation if they were brought to the U.S. illegally as children, Trump appeared to be looking for some wiggle room, tweeting, "Congress now has 6 months to legalize DACA. If they can't, I will revisit this issue." Today, Trump insisted he wasn't muddying the waters.
No mixed signal at all. Congress, I really believe, wants to take care of the situation.
And said he's hoping to sign legislation that protects the Dreamers and beefs up border security.
I'd like to see something where we have good border security and we have a great DACA transaction where everybody is happy.
As Trump navigates a jam-packed domestic agenda, he's also juggling escalating tensions with North Korea.
We will not be putting up with what's happening with North Korea.
He spoke today with Chinese President Xi, who's holding out hope North Korea will back away from its nuclear weapons program.
He's very much in favor of the de-nuke of North Korea, and we're talking about different things.
As for President Trump, he's still not ruling out a military option.
We'll see what happens. Certainly that's not a first choice, but we will see what happens. Thank you very much.
Now, the president was speaking in North Dakota. He referred back to that meeting he had with congressional leaders earlier today and insisted that everyone left happy, not too happy, because you can never be too happy in those scenarios, but insisting that both Republicans and Democrats are fine with that deal. Trump was in North Dakota to sell tax reform. We'll see how eager Republicans are to work with him after the stunt he pulled at the White House today. Jake?
All right, Sarah Murray at the White House. Let's talk about the president agreeing with congressional Democrats on how to move forward with our panel. Kevin, Paul Ryan this morning called the Democrats' plan to tie these votes together ridiculous and disgraceful. Fast forward a few hours, President Trump says, deal. Shrewd? What do you think?
No, I think he was totally reflexive. I was joking around with Nia. It reminded me of when Kramer went in with Jackie Childs on the episode of Seinfeld, and they were supposed to get $50,000 and all the free coffee, and he accepts the deal right as he says, free coffee. And it seemed very reactionary. It was not very well thought out. There are a lot of people unhappy up on Capitol Hill, but there's also a sense of resignation, which is that's the deal that we're going to have to go forward with. Let's see what we can do, and at least maybe we can get some more floor time now so that we can manage some of the efforts on tax reform.
And Jen, let's put up this photograph that was caught through the Oval Office window of President Trump and Chuck Schumer. There it is. It looks like they're goofing around after this deal was cut. And actually, you know, there are a lot of people who, before the president took office, who thought these two probably can work fairly well together. They're New York deal makers. Trump at one point was a huge contributor to Chuck Schumer, and we saw that side of Trump today, if only briefly.
Well, that's true. He's probably also a better time than Mitch McConnell, so perhaps there's a low bar. You know, he may not feel that way, President Trump, once he realizes that he was probably rolled today by the Democrats, who knew that having 2 votes on the debt limit means there's 2 votes that are must-pass pieces of legislation that they have opportunities to try to attach something like the DREAM Act to. And they've been pretty vocal about that since this deal was cut, but we'll see if he has the same love and almost embrace for Chuck Schumer after he sees the coverage.
Now, the spin that I'm hearing from the legislative director of the White House is that this move by the president clears the decks for tax reform. There is a case to be made for that.
Yeah, it clears the decks. I mean, and there's this legislative logjam, right? And so rolling all this stuff together does clear the decks for tax reform. A number of things that have to get done as well. CHIP, renewing that, a defense bill as well. So the calendar is so packed. So yeah, and that's what you heard Mitch McConnell say too. Essentially say that's the argument that the president made, and that's what they accepted. You know, I think some Republicans who I've talked to said this is basically emblematic of the president's distaste for Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. He essentially went into the Oval Office and kicked them in the gut. And Mitch McConnell in some ways looked like that when he was talking today, like this was something that was very surprising to him. And so here he is now, not only cutting this deal immediately with Democrats, but then flying off to North Dakota with Heidi Heitkamp and seeming to suggest that this might be sort of a new strategy, cutting deals with Democrats, perhaps on DACA as well. So, I mean, we'll see if this is a new strategy from this president. event, but Republicans I talked to...
Hey everybody, it's Jake
happy
Tapper
about
from
it.
CNN State of the Union and factcheck.org, and this week we're going to take a look at comments made by President Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions when describing the program known as DACA, which stands for Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. It's an Obama-era program that temporarily offered protections for undocumented immigrants who were brought to the United States when they were children. As you know, Trump and Sessions this week announced that they were rescinding the program. Take a listen to how they described it. Let's start with Attorney General Sessions.
The DACA program was implemented in 2012 and essentially provided a legal status for recipients for a renewable 2-year term, work authorization, and other benefits, including participation in the Social Security program to 800,000 mostly adult illegal aliens.
And President Trump made a similar point when talking during a meeting on tax reform.
I have a great heart for the folks we're talking about, a great love for them. And people think in terms of children, but they're really young adults.
So, is that true, what President Trump and Attorney General Sessions are saying, how they're describing recipients of DACA? Is it true that the recipients are, as Trump said, really young adults, or as Sessions said, quote, 800,000 mostly adult illegal aliens? Yes, that is true. The individuals in question who benefit from DACA, DACA, Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, are mostly adults and they are undocumented immigrants. But in their descriptions, both the President and the Attorney General are leaving out a very important bit of context, which is that these individuals were brought to the United States when they were children through no fault of their own. DACA, which is now in its 5th year, is open to those who are at least 15 years old and no more than 31 years old as of June 15, 2012. To be eligible for DACA, individuals had to prove that they were under the age of 16 when they arrived in the United States and that they had been living in the U.S. continuously since June 15, 2007. A professor at UC San Diego, Tom Wong, oversaw a national survey last month of more than 3,000 DACA holders, and he found that although 98% of them are currently adults over the age of 18, most of them, 54%, were under the age of 7 when they arrived in the United States. In fact, the average age of a DACA recipient when coming to the United States was 6.5. So here's the bottom line. The comments by President Trump and Attorney General Sessions when describing the recipients of DACA are technically true. They are mostly adults, but they leave out such an important part of the context of who these individuals are, that they were brought here as children, that we are judging those statements to be misleading. A reminder to all you politicians out there, you are perfectly entitled to your own opinions, not to your own facts. I'm Jake Tapper for CNN State of the Union and factcheck.org.
It was supposed to be an easy week for Xi Jinping, a chance for the Chinese leader to play strong global statesman while hosting the BRICS summit in Xiamen. Instead, as has become the norm recently, the event was overshadowed by North Korea. North Korea pushed the button on its 6th nuclear test just as the summit was beginning, a provocative move that is exactly what China didn't want to happen. And yet Kim Jong-un went ahead and did it anyway, a clear sign that he's willing to flout China's wishes. Although Beijing is Pyongyang's only major ally and economic lifeline, Kim Jong-un has shown that, at least so far, nothing will deter him from pushing his nuclear program forward. China has publicly condemned North Korea's behavior, including at the UN.
Stop taking actions that are wrong, deteriorating the situation, and not in line with its own interests either.
China also filed a protest with the North Korean embassy in Beijing that appears to be falling on deaf ears. The nuclear test is the 3rd time a North Korean provocation has outshined Xi Jinping at a major international event. Missile tests disrupted the One Belt, One Road Forum, Xi's major economic initiative, as well as the G20, held last September in Hangzhou. Closing out the BRICS summit, Xi chose not to address North Korea despite it being the top issue of the day. Part of the reason Xi doesn't want to talk about it, he's in the midst of preparing for the 19th Party Congress, the most important political event in 5 years, where the president is trying to consolidate his power through 2022. As a result, the nuclear test has all but been erased from state media. The entirety of the first 3 pages of the People's Daily was nothing but the BRICS summit. CCTV barely breathed a word about Kim Jong-un, and on social media platform Weibo, the term hydrogen bomb has been blocked by censors. Still, sweeping the issue under the rug domestically doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and China will now have to ponder its next move, caught between his Asian neighbors and the U.S. and Russia.
For more than 20 years,
the U.S. is pushing for more sanctions at the UN Security Council, further steps China seems to be unwilling to take. It fears a unified Korean peninsula allied with the West and a potential refugee crisis if the regime collapses. But as Kim Jong-un continues to overshadow Xi Jinping when he least wants it, experts are now asking a new question. At what point, if ever, will Beijing decide that propping up North Korea just isn't worth it? Matt Rivers,
President Trump's
CNN,
decision
Beijing.
announced today to end DACA, President Obama's temporary protection for young undocumented immigrants. 800,000 or more people brought here as children. Many of them have spent their whole lives in America. This is the only country many have known. Here's what the president had to say about them late today.
I have a great heart for the folks we're talking about, a great love for them. And people think in terms of children, but they're really young adults. I have a love for these people, and hopefully now Congress will be able to help them and do it properly.
He loves them, he said. Well, today the president showed his love by putting the fate of all these people in the hands of Congress, people who not only could not pass the DREAM Act, which would have covered them years ago, but as CNN's Jake Tapper put it today, could not agree on what to have for lunch. The president passed the buck to Congress while offering no ideas of his own for what lawmakers should do, which is not surprising given the president's track record so far, but it does run counter to the way he portrayed himself during the campaign. Back then, he was short on details, but seemed to claim to have a plan.
We are going to deal with DACA with heart. The DACA situation is a very difficult thing for me because, I love these kids. I love kids.
should dreamers be worried?
We love the dreamers. We love everybody.
Well, we should point out today the president didn't announce the repeal of DACA himself. He gave that job to his long-suffering attorney general.
The program known as DACA that was effectuated under the Obama administration is being rescinded. We are people of compassion and we are people of law. But there is nothing compassionate about the failure to enforce immigration laws.
Well, the Attorney General announced the program is going to end in March. Effective today, no new applications accepted, and only those people whose status expires between now and March will be eligible to renew. The bottom line, unless Congress acts, hundreds of thousands of young people who are American in just about all respects but a piece of paper would be subject to deportation. For all the president's talk of love, CNN has obtained a background document sent by the White House to offices on Capitol Hill, and it states, and I quote, "The Department of Homeland Security urges DACA recipients to use the time remaining on their work authorizations to prepare for and arrange their departure from the United States." Of course, Congress might suddenly come up with a solution for these dreamers, but the president himself seems to be trying to have it both ways, saying he wants to be compassionate, but not leading from the front on an issue his base is not sympathetic to. Remember, this president ran on his ability to make deals, to bring competing sides together and hammer out plans. It's something he talked about time and time again on the campaign trail.
I'm going to make the great deals.
I am going to make great deals for our country. I've built an extraordinary business on relationships and deals that benefit all parties involved, always.
I make deals. I negotiate. Everybody wants me to negotiate. That's what I'm known as a negotiator. I'm so anxious to negotiate.
Nobody can out-negotiate these deals.
I will make a great deal and lots of great deals for the American people.
We don't make great deals anymore, but we will once I become president.
Making great deals, something the president considered a strength long before taking office. Here's a tweet from a few years ago. Quote, "Deals are my art form. Other people paint beautifully or write poetry. I like making deals, preferably big deals. That's how I get my kicks." Well, today the only kick was to the security and certainty of hundreds of thousands of people living here and a punt to Congress. During the campaign, the president did pledge to end DACA, and he pledged to treat dreamers with heart. He also said he faced a deadline today for doing something or face a lawsuit from 10 states' attorneys general. Some today used terms like boxed in to describe his situation, no good choices. Keep it honest, though, whatever you think of DACA or Congress's proper role, whether you're sympathetic to the president's dilemma or not, it's hard to argue this was his only option. It might be more accurate to say this was the only option available that's also consistent with the way this president has operated so far, which is to grab credit when he can and deflect responsibility for failing to live up to promises he's made. Remember the moment when the White House passed their version of an Obamacare replacement? He threw a victory celebration in the Rose Garden. And when the Senate then failed to pass their version of it, this.
I just want them to get repeal and replace done. All I hear is repeal and replace. And then I get there and I said, where's the bill? I want to sign it first day. And they don't have it.
Well, again, just like DACA, whatever you think of the Affordable Care Act, the president's playbook is pretty similar, and so is the pitch.
Real change begins immediately with the repealing and replacing of the disaster known as Obamacare.
Repeal it and replace it.
Repeal and replace.
Repeal and replace
Obamacare. We're going to repeal it. We're going to replace it. We're going to get something great. Repeal it, replace it, get something great. We're going to kill it. Let it die. Let it die. And we're going to come up with something much, much better. You're going to have such great health care at a tiny fraction of the cost. And it's going to be so easy.
Healthcare, DACA promised to end it to replace it with something better, then reassurances to anyone who might be hurt, then leave it to lawmakers to work it out. So much for the art of the deal.
Well, how's that for a beginning? It's wonderful being here. It's a great beginning. Thank you. Well, tonight we are so grateful for your willingness to be present and to share some of your faith journey. It's not like you've never shared it before, but in this particular moment, it seems particularly important for us to be making these connections between our faith and our public life, our service, and the way we feel our lives are being led. So thank you for being willing to be here tonight to share your perspective and your connection to all of that. And as I said, anyone who's been paying attention knows that you are a person of faith, but it's sometimes good to remind them of some of your history. And so if you wouldn't mind just to share briefly kind of where you have come from, how did the church impact you? What is it that really grounds you in your faith and has given you the strong foundation that has allowed you to do all that you have done and to stand so strong in the midst of so much?
Well, first, let me thank Riverside for opening up this magnificent church, which is really a community to all of us tonight. And to everyone here, thank you for supporting Camp Olmsted, which is such a great mission of the City Society of the Methodist Church here in New York. And Bishop, thank you for your kind remarks and for your leadership. Thanks to Dr. Amy Butler, the lead pastor of Riverside, and thanks to Reverend Ginger for coming from the church that I used to attend when I lived in Washington, and the church I would have gone back to had I been able to live in Washington again. I am very grateful for my upbringing in the Methodist Church and in a community of faith. My earliest years really set me on that path because for me growing up in my family, there was your family, there was your school, there was your church. And we spent a lot of time in church as children and as teenagers because there was such a commitment to the nurturing of young people, our hearts, our souls, our minds, and I was blessed by excellent teachers and a youth minister whom I have written about many times before, spoken about, who helped not only myself but others when we were impressionable in the junior high years into high school, really be challenged about our faith and the role that our faith could and should play in the world. This youth minister, his name was Don Jones, Reverend Don Jones, was young and vital. He drove a convertible, and so we thought he was just the coolest thing ever. He'd been in the Navy before he went to divinity school, and he was intent upon making sure that those of us who lived in our middle-class community, which was all white, knew that there was a bigger world out there. And he arranged exchanges between the young people in our church with churches in inner city Chicago, African-American churches, Latino churches. And then one memorable day, we used to go to, we had Wednesday night Methodist Youth Fellowship, we had Sunday night Methodist Youth Fellowship, we had lots of activities in between. He said that he would take those who got permission from their families to go hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak at Orchestra Hall in Chicago. And I was thrilled. We'd just started hearing about Dr. King, and the idea that we would hear somebody that was becoming such an important figure in our country was exciting. Now, some of the families of some of the students would not give them permission to go. But I was lucky enough that I got to go down on our church bus with a group of our other friends from church to hear Dr. King speak. And the sermon that night is one that he gave on other occasions called Staying Awake Through the Revolution. And some of you might remember it. It was well known. And we stood in a long line to go and shake Dr. King's hand. I tell you that story because what I cherish about my church life as a young person is how it wasn't just a continuing inculcation, a statement of what we were supposed to believe. It was, here is what we hope you will believe, you will come to with your own free will, but we want to expose you to the broader world so that you will make the decisions about your faith consistent with the opportunity to be a witness, to be evidencing in your daily life what your faith means to you. And it was just such a gift that I carry it with me, to this day. And it's not always easy, as you know so well, Ginger, to figure out how best to translate your faith into your daily life, whether you're a preacher or you're in politics or whatever it might be.
Well, and it seems right now, one of the things that I've thought about so much is how difficult it seems to me to be as a person in public life, in public service, to think about how you speak about, how you share, how you integrate your faith with your public service, what you say. Do you say anything about it? Do you not say anything about it? Do the words matter? Is it mostly the actions? How does that really work? And how has that worked how have you managed that over the course of many, many years in the public eye and in public service? How do you do that? How does your faith really impact not just your personal life, but also your public and political positions, commitments, and choices?
Well, I hope, and I try to have it be integrated and to inform my public life. I was raised to believe that actions spoke louder than words, and if you were a person of faith, that should be evident in how you treated other people and what kind of life you lived. So I didn't go around talking about it a lot, but it certainly was foremost in my mind, and I've tried to express it, sometimes more effectively than other times over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. But I've tried to be guided by it even more importantly. You know, I write in this new book that I have coming out called What Happened that there was a real well, thank you. There was a real misconnection between who I am, what I believe, and the kind of campaign that we saw in our country the last year ago. I knew that there were people who were angry and people who had resentments. I understood that. I could see it. But I did not believe, and I'm just not wired to think that the best way for a leader to bring people together to solve problems is to stoke that anger and to feed that resentment. And so I will tell you, I think that the kind of leadership I was offering was not satisfying enough for certain people. And it wasn't enough for me to say, look, I understand, and here's what I want to do to help, if I didn't display more anger so that they could feel that I got their anger. And I think that is a legitimate question about what happened in that campaign in 2016. And it was something that I struggled with because I don't think anger is a strategy. It is certainly justified in the face of what we see oftentimes in our society. But I think leaders, whether it's in the church or in politics or anywhere else, should be looking for ways to try to find common ground or even higher ground, and not to create scapegoats and stoke hatred and bigotry and prejudice and the like. So I've tried to live that. During the campaign, I started talking a lot about love, which I know some people thought, what is she talking about? But I thought
crazy concept.
Crazy concept.
Crazy woman, you.
I know, and
I know.
I mean, I remember the first day I got to college. We got from the chapel. I went to Wellesley College, a women's college outside of Boston. We got some Wellesley people here. I got a little card. I'll never forget it. I saved it for years. A little card which said, "God is love," and so we talked about love in a community concept, a public concept, and it was challenging to do that because there is a large group of people with a very strong opinion that if you're a Christian, if you profess your faith, you can only have one set of political beliefs. And if you deviate from those political beliefs, you somehow are not really a Christian. I reject that completely.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the things we were just talking about a few minutes ago before we came out is just that very thing, the way that Christianity is getting portrayed and the way that it's being put forward in the public square as something that, from my perspective, certainly, it is not. It's so important for us to have voices like yours and other prominent voices that are able to reject that and to offer an alternative. So in the midst of something that was so counter to your faith, and you were facing these days where you must have just felt like you were hitting your head against the wall, so frustrating. And can you think of certain moments when it was just like, I don't know how to counter this? And in those moments, how did your faith play a role to help you push through? What were the resources that you brought to those moments when you thought, it's too much, it's too hard, and I mean, how did your spiritual life really feed you in those moments?
Well, I'll pick one example because it was probably the most dramatic, and that is when I lost. That was devastating. I didn't think I would lose. The two best politicians I know, my husband and Barack Obama, did not think I would lose. And so when it happened, it just threw me back and threw me onto my my own internal resources, and I knew that I had to get up the morning after the election and I had to demonstrate the kind of personal composure and strength in order to deliver a concession speech, but to do it in a way that, you know, wasn't bitter or angry. And I tried very hard to do that. And I also tried to make it clear that we all hoped that the new president would succeed, that we wanted to give him a chance. But as soon as Bill and I left that stage, I just, you know, really felt the whole weight of it on me. And we were in the back seat of the car on our way back to our home. I couldn't speak. I couldn't really have any internal resources left. And so when I write in the book about getting through that period, I relied on several tools, one of which was prayer. And I was lifted up and blessed by a lot of people who sent me prayers, sent me spiritual readings. I also had the support of my family. I got to see the world anew from the eyes of my grandchildren. My friends rallied around and were so supportive. I did some yoga. Try alternate nostril breathing. I highly recommend it.
Oh, good job. That was
kind of
tricky.
calms you down.
That one's tricky.
And yes, I had my fair share of Chardonnay. So. And, you know, because of what I went through, and because I know that every person suffers loss, they suffer disappointment, they may not do it on the international stage running for president, but every one of us knows what that sense of deep discouragement feels like. I write about it because I hope that in some way it can give support, comfort to people who've gone through their own times of loss. And I took a lot of long walks, which I also believe was very healing through a lot of days, all kinds of weather. And I decided to write a book, which was as much for me as for anybody else, trying to make sense of it, trying to come to grips with it, trying to find out what happened and then understand it and explain it. And that was really hard. It was painful to relive it. It was excruciating to try to write it. Sometimes I would write a couple of pages and I'd literally have to go lie down because it was so difficult. But eventually it became cathartic. And through that whole process, and I try to describe this in the book, I had devotionals, I had great writings from people whose faith I respect. Some of it's in the book, some of it is not. I read a great book of a conversation between the Dalai Lama and Bishop Tutu of South Africa about joy. I reread a book that I had first read during another difficult time in my life in the late 90s by Henry Nouwen, a Jesuit priest. I read several of his books, but the one in particular was about, was the parable of the prodigal son. And in it, he talks about the discipline of gratitude. Now, if you're a Methodist, you know we have a book of discipline. And, we're methodical, and we try to be disciplined. And so the whole concept of the discipline of gratitude just struck such a chord with me. So I began every day reminding myself of what I was grateful for and reaching out to try to connect with others and support others. I was very worried when the campaign ended, and I was very worried that young people, particularly young women, would be really devastated and discouraged to the point that they would not remain active or become active. And so I began thinking about ways I could support that kind of activism. And through it all, you know, my faith was really holding me together in a very central way. And it gave me a lot of courage to get up and keep going, and I'm very grateful for that.
As you were describing the process of writing the book, it really reminded me of that the writing itself became a spiritual discipline, and that it was itself a form of prayer and of service. As you think about as you were thinking about those that would receive your words and read your words, be hopefully encouraged and inspired by them. So what a beautiful gift, and such a concrete expression of faith, even though it may not be framed that way. I don't know, you know, but again, drawing some of that into it, I'm so looking forward to reading it. Since the election, you've said that you have, I'm assuming that this book has helped you sort of come to a place where you're feeling okay personally.
Yes.
But that you continue to have deep concerns for our nation. You are not alone. And in what would have been your hometown, we've been struggling in all sorts of ways to try to respond, as people across the nation have been. But I'm wondering what words of advice or encouragement, or what you just want to say about that, first of all, and secondly, what advice or encouragement you might have for folk who seem at this point, folks are feeling really compelled by their faith right now to stand up and to engage, to resist, and to take some risks perhaps that they wouldn't have taken in the past. And so I'm just curious what you'd like to say to this gathered body and to folk across the country who are trying to be putting their faith in action in this really fraught and challenging moment in our national life.
Well, as you said, you and I were talking about this because, for those of you who don't know, Foundry Methodist Church in Washington, it's a venerable church that's been on the forefront of a lot of social change, and it's a very welcoming and supportive congregation, but also a challenging one. And I think for those of us who are people of faith, knowing that this is a time when we are called to find our own truth and to be willing to express it, whether it is in some kind of volunteer activity, supporting the camp with generous contributions, speaking out, going to the Women's March, doing whatever it is to demonstrate that you are living your faith through a form of witness. And I'm going to turn the tables on Ginger for a minute, because she told me that since the election at her church, they've been engaged in what they call sacred resistance. And I think it's important to let her just say a few words about this, because for people of faith, that is one way to conceptualize how you can be active on behalf of causes, on behalf of people who need your voice and your support. I am doing what I can through a new organization I started called Onward Together to support new grassroots organizations and to lift them up, you know, to find the next generation of concerned citizens, activists, organizers, to give them funding, to give them guidance, because we need a lot of activity at the grassroots level. We need people in every community standing up and speaking out. And there is so much to be concerned about. Yes, I am okay, but I am worried. I'm worried that we face a continuing deliberate effort to undermine our values and our institutions as Americans. And it is something that we cannot stay silent about or be on the sidelines about. But there are so many different ways of serving. You know, I like to say resist, insist, persist, enlist. And actually the enlist may be the most important of those four. Enlist in doing something that brings you together with people who not only are like you, but maybe not like you. We have got to start breaking down these barriers, and it is imperative that we speak across all the lines that divide us. Now, I'm not saying that there's going to be miracles and people are all going to have epiphanies, but I am saying if we don't even listen to one another, if we don't solicit, reasoned discussion, we are not laying the groundwork for the kind of change we need. And of course, ultimately, we need to vote. Voting is the #1 act of resistance to whatever you don't agree with, or persistence on behalf of what you do. But Ginger, would you say a few words about sacred resistance at Foundry?
Sure. So after the election, one of the things we realized is that we needed to mobilize. We expected that there were going to be ongoing challenges, not short-term challenges, and that there would be many of them. And we were concerned about burnout and not having the structure and the support to sort of make sure we stayed with it. And so organized a community of folk that, in DC we like to organize and advocate for things. So that's what some folks at Foundry did. And every week since just before the inauguration, we were able to get organized after the election, and just before the inauguration, there's been a team of folk who've been identifying a particular place and way in which people could concretely act that week. And we've been publishing that along with supporting materials so people could educate themselves on whatever the issue was and then know exactly what they could do. They didn't have to sort through all of the news. They didn't have to try to figure out which cause was most important that week. They could go, okay, this is something I can do, and I'm going to do it every week, and if I do that, at least I know I'm staying engaged. So we were trying to provide some resources for people in what can feel so overwhelming. And sometimes in those moments there's so much, it feels very tempting to say, well, I'll just do nothing. And we wanted to try to help people not do that. So.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you say that because, as we are reminded in Galatians, do not grow weary when doing good, because in due season, you will see the results of your work. And it is hard. It's exhausting to stand up and say, don't talk about people like that. Don't treat people like that. Don't insult and demean a whole group of people. Don't take the most recent example, there are so many. Don't take the opportunity for the future of 800,000 dreamers who love and only know this country away from them. And you have to ask, where does that cruelty, that mean-spiritedness come from? It is not from the church. It is not from Christianity. It is not from people of faith. Yes, there are problems, but these are problems we're supposed to work together to achieve solutions for. And it is so important to sustain that onward effort of sacred resistance and find a home for you to do that. That's why having it rooted in churches, as it was in the anti-slavery movement, as it was in the civil rights movement, as it has been in other points in our history,
enables you, when you do grow weary, to rest a while because others are coming forward to carry the load, and then you get your energy back and you get your faith, rejuvenated, and then you can go forward. But we should not cede an inch on these moral and ethical and humanitarian issues that are rooted in what our faith tells us is right.
I was struck when you just said it's not the church, it's not Christianity, because again, I come back to the fact that so many in the public square do think that these sort of hateful, because of what's happening right now in the public square, that these sort of hateful, judgmental, send them home, build a wall, launch a bomb, that all of that is somehow justified by the Christian faith. And again, I think it's so important for those of us of faith and conscience who've been baptized into a church that says resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves, to stand up and say that's not Christianity, that's not the church, that's not the Church of Jesus Christ. So it's a real challenge right now in both politics and in church. I mean, we're really in a struggle for the soul of our church and our nation. Yeah.
And I think using that language for a dialogue about what is at risk and what is at stake elevates it. It's not just politics. It's not just who gets elected and what they say or what they do, or if they're in the Congress, what they vote for. Think about this. There is a persistent effort to disenfranchise millions of Americans. African Americans, elderly Americans, young Americans. It has been going on for years, but with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, this was the first election where it was in full force. And we're beginning to see more and more stories come out about what happened to people who had every right to vote in the election and were turned away, who came with their identification, as an 85-year-old woman did in Milwaukee. She didn't have a photo ID. She doesn't drive anymore. But she came with her Social Security card, her utility bills. She came with education. She was turned away. Story after story. Because back in the 60s, and even before in the 50s, but with great urgency in the 60s, this country finally said voting is a sacred right. Voting is what enables every person to be equal in our country. It doesn't matter how rich or how poor, what color, what gender, anything else. In that voting booth, you are equal. We should be celebrating that, not suppressing it. And so part of our challenge has to be going after these techniques that are being used to undermine the full citizenship, indeed the humanity, of so many of our fellow Americans. It is going to take a lot of individual efforts and some concerted ones to stand up against this, because it's exhausting. It's exhausting having to stand up and say, that's not right. Don't do that. You're hurting people. Stop. I mean, who gets in a Twitter war with Pope Francis?
Come on now.
I mean, go figure, really. But what we are trying to convey, what we stand for, is so much bigger than any one of us, and that's why we need a community. That's why we need to support each other. And it is reason to be optimistic. It really is, to be hopeful and optimistic, because that great arc of justice that we have tried so hard to follow with our faults and our setbacks keeps moving toward
a better life, a better time, a better place on this earth as well as after. And on this earth, God's work is our own. And so we are not just doing it for Hillary or Ginger or Amy or anyone individually. We are doing it because we are part of this great cloud of witness that hangs over us. And yes, I think ultimately judges us, but it is there to guide us in the right direction. You know, on the back of your program, there's something that I said when I spoke at Foundry last year.
Oh, when was that?
It was a long time ago.
It was a while ago.
Yeah.
No, it was a while ago. A couple of years, maybe.
But I said, no matter who you are, where you come from, what your income, your race, your religion, your gender, your age, your ability, you have value, you have dignity, you have something to offer. And so we can't let our politics dehumanize anyone among us, because to diminish one of us diminishes all of us. And therefore, we have to be constantly speaking out with not anger, but passion, commitment, good cheer if you can manage it. And not be silenced. One thing I would ask each of you who is here, whether you are religious or whatever religion you might be, whether you're a person of faith or not, you are here because you are part of a larger community than yourself. If you're a member of this great church, and I first came here when Jim Forbes was preaching back in the day, and I have seen the dynamic spirituality that Riverside represents, we need more people to join us in speaking out and resisting and insisting and persisting and enlisting in the struggles that are ahead of us. But we should do it with a song in our heart. We can't be turned into the mirror image of the people who are peddling hate and bigotry and bias and prejudice and paranoia.
Don't become the thing you hate, right? Don't let yourself become the thing you hate. Well, tonight we've been given a vision of one who has stood in the midst of so much with an extraordinary amount of strength and grace, and that we know has been grounded in faith. And we thank you so, so much.
Thank you all.